Today is day number 2 of our Pastorless podcast. Of course, many of us know that he is teaching classes for men in Africa, and we are all praying for you, Pastor, and those other pastors that are being taught. Yesterday, I started out discussing the subject of goodness and greatness, and I kind of want to continue that thought today. When God finished creation, he said, "It is very good." God called the idea of people having free will good. At the time of creation, it was good because those people had not yet chosen to disobey. However, as we discussed yesterday, they certainly did choose to disobey later on, and it affected not only them, but everyone else greatly. Thanks to Adam and Eve's desire to become something greater, they destroyed the good world that God had placed them in. As you read through the remainder of the book of Genesis, the world becomes more and more corrupt. However, there's a man by the name of Noah who finds favor in God's sight. Through him, God saves his family and cleanses an evil world. Again, however, things devolve quickly. God finds a man by the name of Abram, who was listening when he called him out of the corrupt pagan world. As you read that story, you see imperfect obedience yielding disastrous results for Lot and his family. Later, we find Isaac and Rebekah renewing those altars and wells that were created by their father, and the future looked bright. But then you have Esau and Jacob come along, and these two rascals throw things off for a bit. But then Jacob finally gets his act together and finds the will of God for his life. Along comes 12 rough and tumble boys and a famine. When the children of Leah sell their half-brother Joseph into bondage, they didn't realize that they were securing their own bondage for the next 400 years. I wanted to give you that short historical synopsis of the things that occurred to those people that were chosen by God. This seems disconcerting if you were just looking at it from the outside. Why would I want to be among those chosen people of God if I'm going to end up in bondage? That doesn't sound very good to me. No doubt there are moments of clarity as Noah receives the plans to build the ark, and Abram heard the calling of God, and Sarah sees her promised son born, and perhaps when God distinctly answered the prayer of the servant to find a wife for his master Isaac. Maybe we could even include the time that Jacob finally broke free from Laban's shrewd tactics and packed up his family and moved back to the land that God promised. We can certainly include the time that Joseph was called out of the prison and into the palace where he would judge throughout the famine. There is an incredible message by Brother Gabriel Alviar on our website entitled Moments of Clarity. I encourage you to look it up and listen to it. It does a great job of illustrating these special times in our lives. However, in spite of all this, we've gone through the entire book of Genesis, and we end up in the book of Exodus, in bondage and oppression for the people of God. Again, that doesn't sound very good. Now we have an entire nation, born and raised, with only knowledge of bondage, brick, mortar, and all manner of service in the field. Listen to Exodus chapter 1, verse 12. But the more they afflicted them, the more they multiplied and grew. And they were grieved because of the children of Israel. And the Egyptians made the children of Israel to serve with rigor. And they made their lives bitter with hard bondage in mortar and in brick and all manner of service in the field. All their service wherein they made them serve was with rigor. But notice verse 15. And the king of Egypt spake to the Hebrew midwives, of which the name of one was Shiphrah, and the name of the other Puah. And he said, When you do the office of a midwife to the Hebrew women, and see them upon the stools, if it be a son, then ye shall kill him. But if it be a daughter, then she shall live. But the midwives feared God, and did not as the king of Egypt commanded them, but saved the men children alive. It is onto this scene that we are introduced to a good, if I may use that term, Levite woman. A woman whom I believe wanted to do the will of God in the middle of a complicated, corrupt, and not good world. She, like the midwives, obviously feared God more than the commandments of the king of Egypt. And I don't want to devolve too far into this lane except to reiterate what we've already heard on this podcast, that we ought to obey civil authority all the way up until they undermine the source of all authority, which, whether they know it or not, or acknowledge it or not, is God himself, referred to Romans 13 and episode number 25. But this Levite woman, in verse 2 and 3 of chapter 12, the Bible says, she conceived and bare a son. And when she saw him, that he was a goodly child, she hid him 3 months. And when she could no longer hide him, she took for him an ark of bulrushes, and dubbed it with slime and with pitch, and put the child therein. And she laid it in the flags by the river brink. It was because of these simple acts, all of which I believe were somehow guided by the providential hand of God, that Moses would be found and adopted by Pharaoh's own daughter. Jochebed's friends may have been thinking, how does she think she's going to get away with this? She hid her son in the river that Pharaoh's daughter bathes in. She'll never get away with that. In a climate of faithlessness, all God needs is a man or a woman who earnestly seeks the will of God for their life. God has no way of working in a corrupt world until somebody seeks out his good and perfect will. We know how effective the ministry of Moses was. He led the Israelites into freedom. He led them through the wilderness. And finally, he led them to the promised land again. During those years, we know that God talked with this man face to face. It was through Moses that we received the account of creation that we talked about earlier, and the law of God. Moses received a top-level education through Egyptian teachers and scholars. Many believe that he was in line to become the next Pharaoh. We can trace all of these events back to the simple acts of faith his mother performed when he wasn't even old enough to talk. None of this came as a result of Moses' intellect, his talent, or skill. In fact, all that he knew came from Mama, either directly or indirectly. Even when, because of his own foolishness, he had to run from Egypt, he was connected to a man who was a leader in Midian. And an interesting tidbit about this man is that his name meant friend of God. I think God wanted to bring Moses into the wilderness so that he could build a relationship with him. Moses was chosen because of the sensitivity and obedience of his mother in an ever-corrupting world. We are far removed from the story of Moses, and the world that we live in has become very corrupt. However, in this world, God is looking for Jochebeds that will allow him to work. On our own, we can never be good enough. We can never reproduce that perfect and good world that existed in the Garden of Eden. However, if we seek out the will of God for our lives, that is good, and we can have our own little glimpse of paradise. Romans chapter 12, verse 2 says, "And be not conformed to this world, but be ye transformed by the renewing of your mind, that ye may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God." Church family, I want you to know that I love you and I'm praying for you. Let's go on to have revival, and let's find that good and perfect will of God for our lives. God bless.